Chapter 7, The Broken Circle, Identifying the Malice. In 1974, Dr. Walter Winslow was probably the best-known psychiatrist in the state of New Mexico, the slight, light-haired, bespectacled director of the Bernalillo County Mental Health Center and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, had traveled extensively around the state legislating at community mental health meetings on general psychiatry and drug abuse, and had testified before the state legislature and various courts in forensic settings. So it was not surprising that in a case like this, um, the San Juan County District Attorney's Office came to him for assistance in evaluating the 3 youths charged in the multiple Navajo unalivings. After he was briefed on the facts of the case and the surrounding circumstances, Winslow was intrigued. A 50-year-old father of 8, he had run a large pediatric practice in Vancouver, British Columbia, for 5 years before he had decided to specialize in psychiatry. So he had a long-standing interest in the diseases of children. But after listening to Assistant District Attorney Brian Canton's appeal, Dr. Winslow was not convinced he was the right man for the job. Yes, the case sounded fascinating. Yes, he enjoyed forensic evaluations, likening them to the drama of the operating room where exciting things happened. Decisions had to be made, and the stakes were high, but he only had been to Farmington on 3 or 4 occasions, passing through on his way back to ski Colorado and once to lecture. And since he was only marginally acquainted with the cultural dynamics at work within that reservation border town, he wondered if a psychiatrist living in the area might not provide more expert testimony. He was informed that this matter had been thoughtful consideration, and it was a consensus of all persons involved in the case that the boys ought to be evaluated by someone who was not a member of the community. Dr. Winslow pondered the situation a moment longer, then agreed to put together a team and come to Farmington and conduct the evaluations. The assistant district attorney indicated that he appreciated the offer, but that too had been considered, and everyone felt it would probably be best for all concerned if the entire process took place out of town. Arrangements would be made to transfer the 3 boys to the children's detention home in Albuquerque, just minutes away from the university campus, to make it easier for him. For the same reason, Dr. Winslow thought it would be better for someone acquainted with the cultural milieu in Farmington to conduct the evaluation, a close examination of the social patterns and racial attitudes of the youth in that community seemed to me to be a critical, informative line of inquiry. And so each time I visited Farmington, I would try and locate an eyewitness or participate in the rolling of Indians. In the early 70s, in all, I spoke with more than a dozen. 1 or 2 never opened up. They would listen to my spiel about sullen expressions and then reveal the only reason they agreed to meet with me was to find out who gave you my name. I suspended one guy of hot dogging for the writer. He referred to rolling Indians as the next best thing to sex, and said the authorities ought to have pinned medals on the 3 boys, not prosecute them. Most finally warmed to the conversation, however, and reminisced with candor about those days, admitting to a slight embarrassment, even shame, about their acts now, though to be honest at the time it had been fun. And then along came the definitive interview. That was what we did on Friday and Saturday nights. Drive around looking for drunk Indians to roll. Subs, we call them, as in subhumans. They weren't hard to find. They were everywhere, lying in the alleys, shit-faced, weaving down the side streets looking for a place to flop, staggering along the highway on their way back to the res. God damn, you'd say, let's kick some Indian ass. Maybe it don't make a lot of sense to other people, but it might if they grew up in Farmington or Gallup or Winslow, where this kind of thing went on all the time. And it wasn't just a few who did it. My big brother did it before me, my little one after. I remember going through my older brother's desk and finding a bunch of belt buckles. Where do you get those, Johnny? I asked. Off Indians, he said. Call 'em his trophy buckles. The first I got involved was in the 8th grade. The Allen Theater was the only picture show in town, and a couple doors down was Harry's Bar, where most of the Indians went to drink when they came to town. So what we do see is when our parents took us to the theater, instead of letting them park and buy our tickets, we'd say, just let us out here and give us the money, right? Then we'd act like we were going to go in and stand in line, hang around the lobby for a few minutes, and when they drove off, we'd come back around the lobby for a few minutes, and they drove off, we'd come back and go around in the alley behind Harry's, where the real show was going on. And I mean, you'd see everything. Once I saw two bucks get into a knife fight. Another time I watched a couple get it on there on the pavement. They had no self-respect. We had no respect for them either. About all they were good for was buying booze. We'd give one $5 to get us a couple of quarts of beer from Harry's, tell him he could bury himself a bottle of wine with the leftover change, and hell, an Indian do anything for a bottle of wine. Sometimes they'd go in and we'd never see them again. They'd sneak out another door, and what could you do? But mostly they were good for it. And we get our beer down to before the cops came, and then go up and down the alleys looking to get even for the ones that ran out on us. Like I say, they'd be lying all over the place. So we'd find one off by himself and we'd smack him around, go through his pockets, take his belt and boots. That's where most of them keep their money, in their boots. Not that any of them had much money, and it wasn't money we were doing it for. I mean, we never sat around the house and said, let's go rob somebody. It wasn't like that at all. It was it wasn't like it was even committing a crime. We did it for the kick, man. I mean, they were just Indians. All this before we were able to drive ourselves. Once we got to a set of wheels under us, hey, the game changed. We were still in we were still underage, so we were still underage, so we would still have to find an Indian to buy us booze. But now we'd say, buy yourself a bottle and let's go drinking together, or let's go to a party at Chokecherry. Then once we had him alone, we'd repossess in a manner of speaking, kick him out and kick the booze first and keep the booze for ourselves. See what I'm saying? It really was a big game, and it could be funny if you were in a certain frame of mind. We do things like cruise the Biscay Highway, catch one walking across the bridge, and once he realized he was surrounded, he couldn't get away. He had a choice. Jump in the river or face the music, rock and roll. One time we pulled up beside a pickup full of Indians at a stoplight and called, hey buddy, to the driver. Then he would roll down his window. I tossed this tear gas canister into the cab. Pish! Merry Christmas! We took off and died laughing when we looked back and saw all of them Indians unload. Another time, my friend and I were out cruising and we had a blackjack where we were going to try out. You know, one of them spring-loaded jobs. We weren't out of town and found this drunk old Indian walking home. Okay, Galen, my friend says, I'll pull up beside him. You open the door and lay him out. So he breaks and I jump out and the guy turns around and we look at each other in the face. And I noticed two things right away. He was not old. And two, he was not drunk. Well, I took a couple of swings at him, but it was to keep him off me long enough to get back in the car, and we booked it out of there. One guy named Jimmy developed the best way of rolling Indians. He'd play sick, roll on the sidewalk, moaning, knees cocked up, and soon as Indian would come over to see what was wrong. 'Cause they're good-hearted people, basically, and when the guy leaned over, Jimmy would kick out and plain flatten him. I know guys who drink. They killed some. In those days, we used to have keggers. You know, beer busts out in the hills. We had different places: the Grove, the stand of cottonwoods by the river, the pit, a big hole in the ground up Chokecherry Canyon, the steps where these old Anasazi steps went up to the side of a cliff. A big brother would be our connection. We'd put out the word, there's gonna be a kegger. Charge $2 a head for a good time and all the beer you could drink. Maybe 100, 200 kids would show up. And hey, you could make it pay. I heard there was a kegger at the steps one time. A couple Indians happened to pass by, and a bunch took them up the steps and pushed them off the cliff. That's a long fall. Not many are gonna walk away. They go off that cliff. But there wasn't anything about it in the newspaper, so no one thought much about it afterwards. I never killed one. At least I don't think so. I know there was one time we threw one in the back of a pickup and we were taking him out into the hills to do a number on him, and he come to and jump out. Must have known what he was headed for and figured that was better. I don't know why. We was doing about 50, 60. We could see him bouncing down the road behind us. We didn't go back and check him out, so I don't know how bad he was hurt, but it wouldn't have surprised me if he was history. Rolling Indians had been a time-honored, if unsavory, tradition among Farmington teenagers for a number of years, almost a rite of passage. According to one youth who felt the peer pressure to do it when he was 16, if someone came out and said, let's roll an Indian, you said, no thanks, you were chicken. So it was kind of like your manhood was involved. It was a step forward, like Indians had a way of proving their manhood, going out and killing a buffalo or enemy or whatever. While in Farmington, New Mexico, you weren't a man until you rolled an Indian. Even if he was overstating the case, no one argues that there did not flourish during the time of a brutal form of nightlife for those teens whose sporting inclinations included, in addition to blowing up mailboxes, mooning and soaping windows, the darker frolic of beating up drunk Indians. It was seen as the macho thing to do, and first-person reports from those involved looking back on those days years later also make it clear that 1973 and 1974 things got out of hand. It was just more vicious and seemed to build on itself, recalls one of who was in a position to know. A bunch of guys would go out and their story would be, score one for us. We found an Indian and broke his arms with an axe handle. Then another bunch would go out and try to outdo them, come back with, oh yeah, well, we stoned a guy. And it kept getting bigger and bigger, one trying to outdo the other, like they were going after bragging rights. Those in charge of law and order then will acknowledge that the streets of Farmington turned mean during this period and blame a lot of it on dope, which was everywhere. But those who were doing the drugs were, well as the rolling deny it. A lot of us were smoking marijuana, but that was no big deal. I know kids who got high before they went to school and church. Anybody who knows what they're talking about knows grass will put you in a deep sleep before it get you out looking for trouble. People in this country would like to blame it on drugs, but that's because this is an anti-grass country. You know, boys couldn't be normal who smoked dope, but it wasn't a drug thing. Accounts for why it got so rough during this period vary. Some cite a general rise in frustration that needed an outlet. and the Indians made convenient scapegoats. You had pent-up anger you wanted to get out of the system. What better way to let it out? In the shape they were in, they couldn't fight back. Ready-made victims is what they were. Some point to specific grievances with Indian people that gall them. It really pissed us off to see them driving around in new pickups, knowing they bought them with government money, when we had to scratch and borrow for some old clunker. Others, however, turned it around and blamed a controversial new law, so unpopular even the police were refusing to diligently enforce it. Less than a year earlier, simple drunkenness had been decriminalized instead of arresting hapless indigents. Police were supposed to escort them to a treatment facility or place them under protective custody until they dried out. The fact that Farmington did not have at the time a detox center, and some Indians now saw the city jail as a safe, semi-permanent shelter, explains why many local officers choose to ignore the drunken Indian problem, or at best would escort inebriated Indians to the reservation border, swat them across their behinds with a nightstick, and send them home in an ungainly loop, therefore provoking the youth to justify their activities. You don't take care of it, we will. But the final outrage for many was killing of Kevin Arnold. On December evening in 1973, a popular Farmington High School graduate named Kevin Arnold was driving home from a date to his new red Corvette. Beside him sat his 20-year-old fiancée. As he passed through an intersection, another car driven from an intoxicated Navajo teenager was speeding to elude Farmington police, slammed into him broadside. The impact knocked the sports car into a mobile home. City firemen called it to the scene, were forced to cut through the car with a saw to extract the two bodies. Although the Navajo youth was charged with vehicular homicide, he never served time, an injustice many understood to have occurred because he was the son of the ranking officer on the Navajo Tribal Police Force. Many would believe that the resentment felt by friends of Kevin Arnold at Farmington High accounted for the increased level of violence toward the Southside drunks. When that goddamn Indian got off, things escalated. That was the moment that rolled the ball right there. It was total anger after that. And after that, an interscholastic sporting event, whenever an Indian went down to defeat of the hands of an Anglo athlete, you could hear, "Remember Arnold," called out like a battle cry. And in the south part of town where the Indians hung out, the heretofore antics of adolescents turned predatory. Weapons came into play: lead pipes, baseball bats. One kid drove bar nails through a softball, attached it to a chain fixed to a handle, and would swing it like a gladiator. Taking out more than one at a time became the challenge. Unofficially, the record stood at 6, and it went like this. On an unreasonable, warm spring night, half a dozen Navajos sat side by side on a long pipe that ran along an alley near the hospital, passing bottles, chatting quietly, nodding to themselves. There were no streetlights back there, so everything was shades of black, and they were feeling no pain. So none of them noticed a pickup with its lights doused, purring softly as it crept down the alley toward them. At a signal none of them heard, there was an explosion of light and sound. Tires screamed, a V8 roared, and blinded by the headlights, the men simply turned their heads. They never saw the Louisville Slugger held out to the side of a figure crouching in the bed of the pickup until it hit them. The whole row was mowed down, one after the another. Bum, 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 bam. We went 6 for 6 that night, went the joke, and as if they were keeping track of a batting average, but in the game, the only time someone struck out was when others got there first. You'd hear stories about that, how a bunch of cruising the alleys for Indians and all The ones they could find were already stretched out bleeding on the pavement. Still, according to those who ran and rolled with Crawford, Burke, and Thacker, there was a radical difference between those who thought beating up Indians was a good time and what was done to the Indians who were taking up Chokecherry Canyon. After deciding that the three youths should be assessed individually, Dr. Winslow approached several of his colleagues in the department. He enlisted the support of Dr. Richard Rada, an assistant professor of psychiatry and an interest in legal forensic work, who had written about men and RAPE, and assigned him Orrin Thacker. Dr. Benjamin Cummins, a child psychiatrist, was given Peter Burke. Dr. Alex Quink, an associate professor of psychology and a certified clinical psychologist, was brought in to administer a battery of psychological tests on each of the youths. The Dr. Winslow chose Vernon Crawford and his subject. By their very nature, psychiatric investigations that are undertaken in a forensic setting rarely produce the same kind of deep revelations that come with a long-term trusting therapeutic relationship. Dr. Winslow, the stage is set differently. You begin by saying, "I'm Dr. So-and-so, but I want you to understand I'm not here as a treating physician. I'm not here to help you through your problems. I've been sent here by the court and by your lawyer to understand what happened. I'm evaluating you for the benefit, not yours directly. Whatever you say can be used in court because what you tell me is not confidential. I'll make inferences from whatever you say and hope what I can say will help you, but I don't know that. You have to tell them that, even juveniles. If you don't, the court could throw your entire testimony out, so naturally there's more guarded in the conversation. They don't tell you as much." Dr. Winslow planned to meet with Vernon Crawford on at least 3 separate occasions, but only spoken with him once before something very strange happened. It was a Saturday evening and was at home when he received a call from Crawford's parents, who said they were in Albuquerque and wanted to come over and talk to him. He didn't think it was a good idea, and to put them off, suggested they call his office on Monday if they wanted to schedule an appointment, but they insisted, saying they had information that would be of help to help him in understanding their son and what had happened. Still not sure it was the right thing to do, he reluctantly gave him his address. This was the first time he had spoken with the Crawfords directly, and after they arrived at his house and made get acquainted talk for about 10 minutes, the father asked him, "Tell us, do you really think our son did it?" It was not a question Dr. Winslow expected to be asked, and wondering if he had made a big mistake allowing this meeting to take place, he exhaled slowly. He said he did it. He described doing it to me, so I have to assume that he did it. The mother spoke up. "That was not what we meant. We mean, do you think our son might have been demon possessed?" Dr. Winslow stared at each of them for a moment. Obviously, they were very serious. He looked down. Not a believer in demons, he had a little trouble with the one, but he treated it as a possible explanation, though not one that was appropriate in his case. "I don't really think so. There didn't seem to be a change in his consciousness when he described the event, and from what I know about demon possession, it comes from another world, right?" They stared at him steadily. "We think he was," and they went on to say that they had heard some kids in Farmington High School were involved in devil worship, and they believed that somehow their son had gotten caught up in it. They were certain that the devil had gained control of their son and that he, not Vernon, had done those things. Much later, reflecting on the moment, Dr. Winslow would admit to a very odd feeling, because when they told me this, it was such a They believed it strongly. They were convinced of it, and they intensely wanted corroboration from me. I think that's what surprised me most, less the idea of demon possession than the parents' belief that this kid was possessed by some evil spirit who had done these evil things. Not wanting to shatter them with sarcasm or skepticism, or to encourage the line of thinking, Winslow shook his head, and I just don't think so. There has been no evidence of his desire to disassociate himself from his actions. He did not say to me, I didn't do it. I was told to do it. He has not told me he was possessed. He has never mentioned Satanism. He has not even said, do this, I must have been out of my head. If you had not come here and told me this, I would never have thought of it. We just wanted you to know that's what we think, the parent said and left. Thinking about the meeting afterward, Winslow felt he understood what was probably going on with the parents. It had been apparent from things they said that they were fundamentalist Christians who believed in good and evil spirits. They were people for whom the devil was not concept but a real being out there who could show up and take over human beings and make them do things they wouldn't normally do. And they were desperate for an understanding of what had gone wrong with their son. This was the perfect explanation for them. It simplified their ability to account for how their son could have done this, which must have been difficult. And in removing responsibility from him, it also put the unfortunate events outside the family. In his initial meetings with Crawford, Dr. Winslow avoided focusing too sharply on what he suspected would be the emotionally charged material, instead prompting the boy to tell his story in his own words, all the while watching out for the corners of his eyes for subtext. In his presence, Crawford was never hallucinatory or irrational, and in fact tried to make a case for himself as a victim of circumstance. He represented the killings as an activity that everyone did that had simply gotten out of hand, and he engaged in a certain amount of finger-pointing, claiming that Peter Burke was behind it all, that he hadn't intended for it to go that far, and when he tried to call it quits, Burke had made fun of him. Throughout the early stages of the interview, Winslow had the feeling that Crawford was talking for the record, not necessarily in the way that made it seem he was playing hustle the shrink as that he appeared to be speaking from a state of denial. So anxious was he to cover himself that it became almost predictable. The way he would say one thing that would leave you thinking just the opposite was probably true. Take the nightmares and hallucinations. Crawford didn't tell Dr. Winslow about them, and when asked, the youth played them down. Sleeping okay, Vernon? Yeah, pretty good. Sure about that? Oh, sometimes I wake up and feel kind of funny, bad dreams, but then I go back to sleep. The staff at D Home said he woke up screaming on a nightly basis and appeared to be hearing inner voices. The staff at D Home said he woke up screaming on a nightly basis and appeared to be hearing inner voices. Dr. Winslow began to probe into Crawford's childhood and home life for events that would provide insights into his understanding. Personality structure, the boy became elusive and ambiguous. He admitted that his older brother was a doper, and that was how he got started smoking pot, but he voiced no complaints about his relationship with his parents, and denied Winslow access to the private quarters of his deepest feelings. Not in this context was Winslow able to motivate a genuine interest and concern on Crawford's part in self-understanding. In particular, Winslow wanted to explore Crawford's sexual attributes. The particulars of the crime suggested that they were committed by someone in whom sexuality and aggression were intertwined and distorted. Often when a victim is beaten, tortured, and abused in the way the Indians were, when physical aggression becomes eroticized, in other words, it means the offender intended to hurt the person in the same way he was victimized. In this regard, the victim symbolizes everything the offender has come to hate about himself and becomes an object of punishment. This is not necessarily so. Sadistic impulses also be a matter of genetics or the expression of other deviant obsessions. But extrapolations and intuition told Dr. Winslow that sex was an area of conflict for Vernon Crawford that had a strong bearing on his particular psychopathological variant. Crawford was extremely uncomfortable with this direction of questioning, asked about masturbatory practices in early sex play, and whether his experiences had been pleasurable or painful and what form they had taken. Crawford became embarrassed and agitated, forcing Dr. Winslow to make a lot of influences if he was going to diagnose the precise psychology behind Vernon Crawford's behavior. Inferences he might entertain in his own mind, but inferences that were too speculative to put into a report. There was no question that a person who frequently seeks artificial sources of gratification and thrills from the sadistic brutalization of other human beings has severe problems, and Winslow might think that the classic kinds of experiences that would cause and contribute to the kind of abnormal character development included SA, but without more intimate information, he would be speculating. When the time came to write up his evaluation, some of the key phrases that Dr. Wilson found himself using were an undeveloped personality with sadistic traits, marked emotional immaturity, and inclination to act out hostile and sexual impulses that most teenagers do not have. While he did not assign a specific diagnosis to Crawford's condition, he did feel that the youth was well en route to a full-blown recognizable illness. Schizophrenia usually doesn't show up until a certain part of the brain maturates. So when you're 16 years old, it's hard to tell whether this is normal chaos of adolescence and he's just having a few weird thoughts, more strange perhaps than average, but not enough to warrant a psychotic diagnosis. Or you're seeing something much more serious like schizophrenia, but I suspected that was what I was seeing. The Crawford family resided in Beckland Hills, a working-class subdivision on the northern outskirts of Farmington. The trim look-alike houses, crew-cut lawns gave the neighborhood a 1950s suburban ambience, but the backyards of the farthest houses bordered an open range that stretched all the way to the Colorado state line. Few, if any, of the men who lived there were college educated, but they made good money working in the oil fields, the gas companies, or at one of the power plants. They came from all over Oklahoma, Kansas, Minnesota, and were the outdoorsy types. Boats and snowmobiles shared the garage with their pickup trucks. Many belonged to the Elks Club, where they went on weekends to smoke and drink and dance. In the summer, they watched their sons play baseball. This is a big Connie Mack town. The Connie Mack World Series is held there. As for the women, they were raised to be content as homemakers. Besides, their husbands didn't want their wives working outside the home, something to do with male pride, ego, and where women belong. Each morning they would put on makeup before they cleaned the house, and when their favorite soaps were over, they would shop for groceries. All the women smoked heavily, Winston and Marlboro, and were perpetually running out of cigarettes, which sent them dashing across the street to borrow two or three from their neighbor. Often they stayed for coffee and to chat, but were sure to be home by the time their husbands returned. If they weren't happy, they rarely realized it until after the children left home. On paper, Earl Crawford conformed to the community profile. During the week, he worked for El Paso Natural Gas and camp maintenance, painting company houses, and he struck out for the Colorado mountains in his RV on weekends and on vacations. But in person, there was something about him that did not support the image of a roughneck at home in the outdoors. Although he was a burly man, he had rounded shoulders and slightly stooped posture. There was a softness about him that seemed more than flesh deep. Certain character subtleties also marked him as different than you'd expect. His speech and manner were timorous. On occasions, his face would take an open mouth expression that looked almost simple-minded, and yet there was also something evasive and sly about him that showed most in his eyes. They rarely met another's in direct contact, constantly darting from side to side with a fretfulness that would be taken for nervous disposition or a tic of a guilty conscience. It was as though he carried the burden of a secret in his past, something hush-hush, and the fear of discovering let him permanently jittery. Ida Crawford, in contrast, was a stout and brash Oklahoma woman with a coarseness about her that was captured in the way she smoked her cigarettes. Once lit, they stayed in her mouth, and she talked and laughed around them until she used them to light another. Without a peep from Earl, Ida sold Fuller brush products and did well enough in sales to become the area manager. In neighborhood, most of the residents thought alike and asked little of one another except company. It did not go unnoticed that the Crawfords kept to themselves. Earl wasn't much for palling around with other men, and when he did go, say, on a hunting trip, rather than share a bunk in the cabin, he stayed himself in his own trailer. Nor did Ida mix with other women. On an individual basis, each displayed a certain civic mindedness. He was a volunteer on the sheriff's posse and was a member of the volunteer fire department, and together they bowled in a co-ed league, but they were never an outgoing, not sociable couple, and they exhibited a wariness about those living around them. One neighbor whose backyard abutted theirs characterized it as a strange watchfulness. Not like they were voyeurs, more as if they were paranoid about being watched themselves. Enough people would also speak about the parents' approach to discipline within the household to make it worth mentioning. Apparently her hand ruled, and he would light into him if he tried to correct the kids. Not only that, it was rare for Ida to be troubled by the thought that her kids might be in the wrong. After an altercation involving one of the Crawford boys, a next-door mother tried to talk to her about this. She came away thinking, protective maternal instincts are one thing, but the way that woman just flat out said, my kids wouldn't do that, well, as time showed, she was flat out wrong. Vernon had an older brother by 4 years named Dalton, and by just about every account he was a nasty, brutish kid, a cruel turkey in the words of a peer. He liked to unalive animals just to unalive them, especially if somebody liked them. One time he found a snake and he was throwing it up in the air with a stick. He told him I'd trade him my old chemistry set for this, just to get him to let it go. He laughed and said, no deal, and beat it to death. With smaller kids, he was just a rough bullying them into carrying his school books home from the bus or shagging flies for him when he wanted to practice hitting baseballs at the park. He sported homemade tattoos when he was a kid, an eagle and a snake. And when he was barely in his teens, he was already selling joints at the local 7-Eleven for $1. The greatest shock for those acquainted with the two Crawford boys when it was announced that one of them had been arrested for murdering Indians was which boy stood accused. They thought the authorities must have had it wrong. They expected as much as Dalton, but not Vernon, the nerd, as everyone called the other. Most boys who hold on to their baby fat throughout the elementary school tend to hang back. And some of Vernon's reserve was probably in reaction to the wild energies that drove his older brother. But even though he was pudgy and reticent, he was always game. For the youth of Beckland Hills, the wilderness to the north, there was a playground, and Vernon would happily trap lizards, climb the sandstone bluffs, build forts, and play war. Opposing armies would be made up of 3 or 4 kids to his side. Saturday morning would be spent digging trenches in the sand. The rest of the weekend was continual round of raids, and Vernon was reliable infantryman. Then, for unknown reasons, Vernon turned strange. Something, some event, some experience, some development seemed to transform him from a regular kid into the neighborhood sissy. No one knew what to attribute to it, but everyone noticed the change. His grade school teachers reported immature behavior and childish talk in class. His neighborhood friends noticed he suddenly became uncharacteristically withdrawn, lacking in self-confidence and subject to mood shifts that were inappropriate to the circumstances. He no longer appeared to enjoy the unusual activities, and when he did engage in them, his emotional overreactions to certain situations earned him the label crybaby. If he scratched an elbow or knee in the normal course of roughhousing, he would quit and go home complaining that everyone was out to get him. Popped up on the shoulder, even in jest, he was apt to burst into tears. Not surprisingly, his popularity in the neighborhood diminished, and the disaffection apparently was mutual, because now, rather than finding pleasure in a game of catch or camping out with kids his own age, Vernon could be found playing with trucks in the dirt with the younger children in the subdivision. While a number of the neighbors noticed Vernon's affinity for children, none associated with a problem, and nothing out of the ordinary was reported to them by the kids. The only insight into what might have been going on with Vernon would come from his father. Probably it came from me, because I'm this way with kids. I love to get close to them. When I was working for the company as a painter, we go into people's homes and they'd have little kids, and it was a challenge to me to get close to those kids. If I'm with a kid and he shies and backs away from me, I want to overcome his resistance, and I'll do what I can to get him to come. Let me hug him, pick him up, and I'll keep trying until I win him over. Get him to be friendly with me. It gives me a good feeling to get a strange kid to come to me, and let me hold him. I don't know why. Nor did Vernon give an accounting for his feeling for kids, and before long it no longer stood out as unusual, coinciding as it did with a growing eccentricity in other areas. Accounts of Vernon's odd behaviors from classmates in junior high school put him on the fringe when it came to the normal antics of adolescence. His idea of a joke was to ask classmates if they wanted to see human finger he'd found, and when they expressed curiosity, he would hold out a little box that contained what appeared to be a bloody amputated finger on a bed of cotton, but was actually his own mercurochrome dab finger snuck through a hole in the bottom of the box. This fascination with mutilation themes and body parts soon caught the attention of his teachers. Jackie Nielsen was his 8th grade art instructor, and she remembers that she first suspected he was a disturbed young boy when he handed her a drawing of naked Indians one day after class. She was very savvy enough to know this was an age when many youths were experiencing first-time sexual urges. When they often fantasized about an art, what made those drawings troubling to her was the violence also expressed. The Indians were being drawn and quartered by hot rods blasting toward the four corners of the page. Unsure how she would interpret those artworks, Miss Nielsen tried to talk to Vernon to determine what was going on in his mind. She came away with the distinct impression that everything drastic had happened at home and his behavior was a statement to his parents as well as others. But he refused to say what was bothering him specifically. After school one day, she shared her concerns with Vernon's English teacher, Judy Turner, who told her she too was observing abnormal tendencies. I had Vernon in English class when he was a junior high school, and if I would give the students an essay to write a paragraph after reading a story, about 90% of the time his stories were very sad, very depressing, and very sadistic. We had a mystery unit, and sometimes I would assign an art project to go with it, a diorama or something like that. His diorama was a bed with a decapitated head in it, and the body hanging in the corner. Now, a lot of kids will do spooky, scary things, especially around Halloween. They do little caskets or even hanging body, but not a decapitated one. Those are the kind of things he would come up with. And periodically, he would be extremely volatile. We might be talking about a particular topic, and he would get emotional and upset and react unusually and violently to whatever it was we were talking about, as if he himself were personally involved or thinking about something that was associated with the topic. Let me give you an example. One time the class was discussing friendship and how it was important to have friends. We could talk to him, confide in him, and that seemed to disturb him. He'd say he didn't have any friends, or he'd say, a lot of people will talk to you, but they're not really your friend. Another time we talked about families, about closeness between sisters and brothers, and doing things together, this sort of thing. He didn't like that at all either. Families aren't like that, he'd say. And it wouldn't be just in the course of a discussion. He'd be sitting there with very calm and very placid, and I would think he wasn't even listening to what we were saying, and then he would just interrupt. It wouldn't be his turn. He wouldn't ask if he could comment or whatever. He just blurted out as if it were simmering inside him, and finally boiled over. Then after class it was, "I'm sorry, Miss Turner, I shouldn't have said that." I would try to talk to him about what it was that was bothering him, but he didn't want to talk about it. I don't think he had any particular hate for Indians. I remember him sitting in class beside a boy who was part Anglo and part Indian, and he had some hostilities because he wasn't accepted by either group. But Vernon didn't object. It didn't seem to matter if he sat next to an Indian or Mexican or whatever, and to it did to some. They'd come right out and say, "I don't want to sit beside him," and we would talk about different cultures and their beliefs, and That never seemed to have an effect on Vernon, at least not in my class. Deep down, I knew when he was doing this stuff that, well, it was probably a cry for help, but I didn't know how to help. It's real hard for a teacher to go to a parent and say, I think there's something wrong with your child. Parents always stick up for their kids. Say, who are you to say that? Mind your own business. Today we have a law that requires us to do that, and we are protected by law. Then we weren't. I can recall when we wrote about feelings, if we equated them to a color, his were always black. And he would talk about the devil devil a lot. In his stories, the devil would play a big part in the directions the character would take. He would tell the character to burn a house down, for instance. In one, it would take a girl out into the country, and he didn't talk about rape, just hurt her, is what he would say. Lord forbid, I didn't want to know how. I didn't want to get into that. I was afraid he'd tell me. Then what would I do? By the time Vernon Crawford entered Farmington High School, his strangeness was almost legendary. A crook smirk tugged at one corner of his thick-lipped mouth, and when he was moved to laughter, he would shake with whooping convulsions that left him breathless. It was a crazy laugh, remembers a classmate. You hear it on TV all the time on horror shows. At first, just like a TV, it was funny until it gets to the point you recognize it's someone who has serious problems. Then it's scary. There were people who quite frankly couldn't stand to be around him just because of his laugh. And to that, to taste in clothes that rejected the typical jeans and t-shirt for dark, gloomy patterns. A case of acne so bad it looked catching, and a hairstyle all his own, unwashed, combed from the crown forward, with a flip at the end to keep it out of his eyes. And it was small wonder no one wanted to sit beside Vernon Crawford in class, and he was always eating by himself in the lunchroom. A classmate remembers there were different in-groups back then. You had the hippies, the long hairs, who drove vans, Volkswagen buses, pieces of shit primarily, whatever would run and smoke cigarettes and pot. You had the jocks who were the apples of mommy and daddy's eye. Vets and Camaros had hung out in front of the cafeteria near the gym entrance. And you had the goat ropers, your cowboys with their pickups, hats, and snuff tins in the back of their pocket of their jeans. It was really a place, though I don't suppose it was much different from any other high school in America back then. Anyway, if you weren't in, you were out, and Vernon Crawford was as far out as you get. There was something funny about him. He did nothing to hide it. Whatever it was, nobody I knew wanted anything to do with him. And adults accounting for his lack of popularity abound, he would carry pranks beyond the point where they were funny. To anybody but himself. Once he pushed two girls into a small closet, locked the door, and said he was going to let them out. They laughed, sure that he was kidding, and wanted for him to open the door. Time passed 2 hours before a teacher heard them calling for help. He had a morbid sense of humor. Girls would blanch and recoil when he would shake a baggie in front of them full of something gushy and ask them if they wanted to see his collection of deer brains and dog hearts, and he would get a big laugh out of their revulsion. And effeminacy became more pronounced. Another classmate remembers, looking back on him now, almost wanted to say he had what had what have come to be known as GAY qualities. His voice was pitched high and had a lit to it. I can still see him in this one swimming class we had together. He was always cold, way colder than anybody else it seemed, and a real wooze about getting wet. He'd tippy-toe around the edge of the pool, dig a big toe in, shiver, and hold his elbows. No one else did that, no one. The list of oddity goes on, but nothing else he did compares to the thrill he seemed to get from rolling Indians. According to those who knew Vernon during the period, it was when he turned 16, passed the driver's test, and was given the use of a Ford Galaxy by his father that things changed for the even worse. The fact that he had access to an automobile and others didn't him a sudden popularity. Gave him a sudden popularity. Enjoying his new status, he would cruise Maine with a car full of kids, or he and a couple of boys would go to the bowling alley to try to pick up girls, although he never seemed to be interested in girls. He just supplied the ride. And riding around the south side of town, whenever Vernon spotted a drunk Indian, he would pull up beside him. Someone would jump out and grab a hat, and he would be the getaway driver. Soon he was catching parties because he was rarely invited to listen to music or dance, but to see if he could get someone to go downtown with him and hassle drunk Indians, we don't think so. You've got the wrong place, Vernon, was the customary response from the disguise with the recruitment efforts, which averaged 90 to 95% of the party. Now and then, however, someone would say, "Why not?" and follow him out. He wasn't into physical harm yet. One who went along remembers just giving them a hard time. That soon, once he got a taste of it, he developed an appetite. By the time he was a junior, he lived for Friday and Saturday nights, when he would head to the alley behind Harry's Lounge and the Esquire liquor store on a search and destroy mission. Now he was no longer content just giving them a hard time or hunting for some souvenirs. Something else was going on. Doing violent things to defenseless drunks excited him in a particular way, and he would attack them savagely with no other apparent intent to inflict pain. According to some of those who went along with him on these escapades, this escalation led to stuffing them in the trunk of his car and taking them into the hills. He had to keep an eye out for cops on patrol downtown, but in the canyons north of the city, he could be unrestrained in what he wanted to do, which was to raise the violence to a higher level. Once he tied one to a tree and proceeded to beat and kick him mercilessly. Another time he tied one with a rope in the back of his car and dragged him around the desert. Remembers one classmate, I was with Vernon one time when he pulled up beside an intoxicated Indian and said, "Let's go to the caves and drink some beer." The guy misunderstood him, thought he was saying, "I'll give you some cake and beer." And that sounded good enough to him to get in the car. You'd think the guy would have been smarter than that. Surely he knew enough to beware of white teenagers on weekends. Nonetheless, he got in the car, and I think there were 4 or 5 of us. We squeezed together to make room. So we go out into the hills, pushed him out of the car, knocked him down, and were beating him up. But he offered no resistance. He just lay there, curled up, playing possum, which took the fun out of it. So what does Vernon do? He says to us, "Get back in the car. I'll run over him." "Nothing doing," I said. I walked home that night. It was evident to most of those who accompanied Vernon that his desire to hurt people came from some source other than their own for accompanying him. They might get their punches in, but when they backed off, he would step up the beating. He took things a lot further than they were comfortable going, getting a thrill out of beating people and hurting people, requiring ever more extreme experiences to satisfy himself, and often taking the abuse in a different direction than anyone else was inclined to go. Another classmate recalls that Vernon seemed to get some kind of sexual charge out of what he was doing, taking their duties off and aiming his attacks at the genitals. The adrenaline rush of danger and excitement building to discharge of raw, aggressive energy, and afterward driving home an expression of his exquisite pleasure. Man, that was good. No one else did that, no one, and sensing that this was leading into something worse, most pulled back, making up excuses the next time he invited them to go cruising. The world saw two Vernon Crawfords during this period. He struck so many who met him as a contained youth, exceptionally polite to adults, different even who may have had his crazies. But then most students during the 70s seemed to be marching out of step, and in contrast to those whose rebellious attitudes put them in constant conflict with school authorities, Vernon on the surface appeared to have been a social conscience. He was a volunteer in the Future Teachers of America program. Several mornings each week he would go to the elementary school on the other side of town where he worked as a teacher's aide to second graders. Furthermore, on a questionnaire handed out to all students in the space for club membership, while he belonged to none, he wrote he could be interested in joining any club where he could go around town helping people. Yet those who spent more time around him would voice the common refrain, he was a weird trip. He would sit under a sun lamp until his face blistered in second-degree burns, listen to rock and roll music on headphones with the volume cranked up as loud as it could go, and baring sharp teeth in a malicious grin, he would brag in the school corridors about degenerate things he had done to drunken Indians over the previous weekend. Some of his boasts were so outrageous his listeners would think he was putting them on, making up stories to back them up. He would invite believers to his locker, where he claimed to have collection of Indian fingers, taken the way GLS in Vietnam took Vietcong ears. There he would sometimes pull the old finger in a box routine, or bring out a swollen, bloody finger that looked very real, but in truth was rubber and had been purchased in an Albuquerque novelty store. Few people at the time seemed to have gotten a great deal of thought to what was going on with Vernon Crawford. It was easier to dismiss his tasteless statements and actions as a desperate means of gaining attention, and any reaction would have form of reward. Those few who spent time with him blamed it on drugs. Apparently it was in blow grass with him on the way to school when he were in junior high, recalls a kid from the neighborhood. Another tells of going to the Crawford house to listen to music and Vernon sneaking in his parents' medicine cabinet, shaking a handful of pills out of a bottle, and swallowing the lot. But not even they would go as far as to try to explain his crimes as those of a drug addict. Look, Cook, who went grossly out of control when he got high. Only one person in authority, it seemed, recognized there was something dreadfully wrong with Vernon, and that was his high school history teacher, B. Bleckley. I must confess, Vernon was a boy who did not appeal to me a lot. He was sort of smarmy. I really can't well I really can't. Well, he always tried so hard to be so nice to me. No matter what I said, he watered my plants and would want to be helpful in all sorts of ways. Butter would melt in his mouth. He was so sweet. He reminded me of, remember the TV show Leave It to Beaver? Remember Eddie Haskell? And I guess what put me off was I never felt it was a true niceness. It rang false. There was so much sincerity and it struck me as insincere in a creepy, sickening way. He was never an outstanding he was never an outstanding student, but over the course of the year he got steadily worse. Deteriorated really as far as his work, attendance, attitude. At first I attribute it to drugs, but I have to say he was more abnormal than drugs would explain. So I went down to the office to the vice principal and I said I was concerned about this boy. I found his response disturbing and I thought he needed psychiatric help. I was told they would keep an eye on him, which I took to mean my job was to teach, not play counselor. I really feel like I missed that about Vernon. It seemed I sensed strangeness and oddness. I sensed disease within his soul, frustration and unhappiness. But I never saw anger or violence. When I heard he was going to be arrested after school, one of the teachers at lunch that day told me Vernon had been bragging and the police were going to pick him up. I felt Vernon was the kind who would say he did it when he didn't. And to me, this was even sicker in a way, that he would get a perverse pleasure, some secret joy out of saying all these grisly things just to make people think he did it. To me, it takes a really weird person to claim they've done something like he did when they haven't. And I thought he was twisted enough to get a big kick out of it, the attention it would bring him. I had him the very last hour the day I heard they were going to arrest him. It was Friday and there weren't many kids in class, and I was always carrying things from the classroom to my car, back and forth. On that particular day, I'd parked way at the end of the parking lot. I didn't want to have to lug what I had all the way by myself, so I said, would anybody like to help me carry these things to my car? And guess who jumped up? Sweet Vernon. Who would do anything for me. My heart sank. I still did not believe he'd done it, but I did think if I heard who was going to be arrested, he might have heard. Countless times I've given kids the keys to my car with instruction and never worried about it, but I didn't dare hand Vernon the keys because I thought he would take off. In case he panicked, I didn't want to be the one to give him away to get away. So I said I would come too. I wasn't the least bit nervous. I felt no personal threat whatsoever from Vernon. Maybe he didn't feel hostility toward me and that's why I didn't pick it up. Maybe it was because he was always carrying my favor and I was feeling guilty because I didn't like him. And even though I'd been told what he was going to be arrested for, I still didn't believe he'd done it. I thought once the police checked on him out, they'd find he was lying and I'd see him in class Monday. I don't know how I missed the violence unless you knew what I'm reminded of. Remember that scene in Psycho at the end where Anthony Perkins says, "You know me, I wouldn't hurt a fly." Vernon and I walked all the way down the deserted parking lot together and back. That was the last time I ever saw him. Dr. Ben Cummings met only once with Peter Burke because the way the juvenile code read a youth to have to be at least 16 years of age before he had even been considered for bindover for adult trial. At 15, Peter Burke's offense was automatically classified as an act of delinquency, and no matter what evaluation turned up, he was going to be treated to some as if he had caught stealing hubcaps. Putting a finer point on the irony based on the little he saw and heard, Dr. Cummins suspected that this boy might have been the most incorrigible of the lot. It didn't seem to matter to Peter Burke that he had unalived people. A file containing sketchy biographical information was supplied prior to the interview to let Dr. Cummings know family history alone could explain a lot of the way Peter Burke turned out. Just to outline the death of his father in an oil fire when the boy was small, a mother who apparently drank herself to death, made it easy to imagine how someone roughed up by the kind of history could go wrong. But it was not an inevitable connection. Research indicated there were people who, having had similar experiences in their past, might just logically have developed a strong sense of altruism, even though whose reaction was manifested in hateful feelings and hostility, while they might have sometimes feel like striking out at someone who angered them, that didn't mean they would do it. The fact that Peter Burke had a twin brother who started out at the same place only 13 minutes later, who the record indicated was a decent kid, appeared to argue that circumstance alone could not adequately explain why Peter Burke had ended up an antisocial deviant rogue by the time he was 15. So for Dr. Cummins, the real issue to be explored was what separated the youth. What were the inner workings that coerced him to step over a line that was statistically rare and follow a murderous behavior pattern? But that was something that would be learned only if Burke was willing to cooperate, which he was not. Dr. Cummins was unable to open him up a little bit. Burke spoke with long pauses between sentences and sometimes didn't even bother to answer when asked a question. He was uncommunicative in a way that made Cummins' attempts at conversation off-putting as an police Cummins' attempts at conversation as off-putting as police interrogation. Not that Cummins really expected him to be able to explain what he'd felt that made him want to do what he'd done. He doubted if Burke's self-awareness included the information. That was true of most adolescents. They weren't in touch with their feelings. They acted without thinking much about their actions or the consequences, leaving it to others to deduce from their behavior what was going on with them. If he'd had to guess, Dr. Cummings felt some of the psychological matics of the crime were probably related to the fact that the boy had lost his parents to the fire and alcohol. And he felt Peter Burke probably veered off on a course by the time he was 11 or 12 that would be extremely difficult to turn around. It was unlikely this was something he was going to grow out of. Indeed, the youth exhibited many of the unusual symptoms that apply to standard psychiatric diagnosis of the sociopathic personality. He was in constant conflict with society, exhibited no loyalty or concern for others, ignored social codes and values, acted only in response to his own desires and impulses, learned little from experience, and remained untouched by punishment. Two family photos immortalize Ted and Doreen Burke. In one, Ted, tall and handsome, poses beside a tanker truck wearing a leather jacket and white tooth grin. looking like a World War II flyboy just returned from a mission that has made him a hero. In the other, Doreen, brown curls floating on the shoulders of a tight gray sweater, smiles shylessly like a 1940s sorority girl, waiting to be asked to dance. You get the impression that others each was the other's photographer and they had a game going. That as soon as she snapped his photo, he saluted the camera with a beer, and she heard the shutter click, her nose wrinkled with laughter. If you look at their lives, starting with their romantic beginnings, he was a Missouri farm boy football player. She was a piano-playing uptown girl, and over parental objections, they had eloped in California. And follow them through the day, they moved into a new 3-bedroom brick house in Sunset Heights, a new development situated on a leveled hill and luminous views to the west, to the birth of twins whom they named after Apostle Peter and Paul as an expression of thanks. The Burkes were almost a 50s poster couple, but it was all downhill from there. The twins were still in kindergarten when Ted, employed by a gasoline distributor, was unloading violets from a diesel truck, and sparks set off an explosion. With clothes aflame, he staggered toward a nearby irrigation ditch where he had found by a passerby. Burn victims don't always look so bad at first, but as the damage continues its relentless course, the infringement and pain get worse. He was burned over 50% of his body, severely around the face and chest, and had taken a lot of heat and gas into his lungs. He lingered for almost 2 weeks. Conscious much of the time, though it would have been better for him and easier on his life if he weren't. His death devastated Doreen, who acted as if she had been stripped of her purpose in life, and after that, to all appearances, seemed incapable of facing life without him unless she had a drink in her hand. As the Doreen all her friends thought they knew disappeared in an alcoholic slide, a slovenly, irresponsible drunkard took her place. To this day, women who know Doreen when her husband was alive will turn with a smart whatever they pass. Someone wearing white shoulders perfume. Think of Doreen Burke, this miserable substitute, paid little attention to personal grooming, wore the same clothes for days running, rarely brushed her hair, completing the loss of discretion and decorum. This woman, who went by the name of Doreen but looked and behaved nothing like her, began to live from one drink and one man to the next. Judging by appearances, she bent on destroying by rejection everything that meant anything to her before, including her children. There had been 2 before the twins, a boy and a girl, Raleigh and Glenda, and now she had all-handed responsibilities of motherhood over to Glenda. But as soon as she was old enough to go out on her own, Glenda left, leaving it up to Raleigh, who was in the 7th grade at the time, to function as a parent, getting the twins ready for school in the morning, cleaning the house, doing the laundry, cooking the meals, basically taking care of the 2 boys and their mother. During this time, friends who had a hard time believing Doreen could fall so low so fast that they could so fast did what they could to slow her descent. Even the family doctor, who was treating her for various alcohol-related ailments and felt she was a better woman than this, spoke up and appealed for her to drink less, if only for her health, but she was impervious to admonitions and advice. And by 1972, 2301 Ridgecrest Drive, the Burke address was a bleeding sore in a neighborhood that had become staunchly middle class. The house not only needed painting, the yard watering. Those had ventured inside were appalled at the clutter and filth. Clothes were strewn across the floor and furniture. The sink was piled high with dirty dishes, which accounted for the candy wrappers, fast food containers spilling from the overfilled garbage cans. When the doors and windows were open, the place reeked like an open container. Rumors of drunkenness and promiscuity had been making the rounds of the neighborhood for some time when Doreen scandalized the gossip mongers by letting a stranger move in. They said her judgment was as pickled as her system. When she decided to bring Dave home, the guy was 10 years younger and half-foot shorter than Doreen and looked like an unwashed hippie. The last job he'd had was in a traveling carnival, and since then he'd been drifting. The only thing they had in common was a preference for Schlitz. They could waste whole days guzzling a case of it. It was painfully obvious to others that this guy was a sleazy hustler, a worthless freeloader taking advantage of a pitiful lonely widow who was crashing. But she would hear none of it. The closest she would ever come even in explaining would be a letter to an old friend living out of state, in which she admitted, "There's no fool like an old fool, but what a lover." The same friend remembers when not long after receiving the letter she returned to Farmington. Doreen called and said she was coming over. We hadn't seen her since our return, and she staggered in with a six-pack in her hand, already drunk. And she insisted, and we have one with her, this in the morning, mind you. Well, she rattled off about this guy who gave me the creeps when I saw him, but she insisted he made her happy, and I don't know, it just seemed like she was trying too hard to convince us she was doing great when it was apparent her life was going down the drain. Then I stopped listening and started worrying about her driving home by herself. Just when people began to wonder how much longer she could go on living like this, on July afternoon 1973, Doreen collapsed as if she'd been hit on the head with a hammer. A brain aneurysm, the doctor said. According to friends, her body just said, "Enough, I can't take it anymore." Dead at the age of 45, it was a pathetic conclusion to an immeasurably sad life, and a tragic epitome was added when, not 1 year later, her son Peter was picked up for the cold-blooded murder of 3 alcoholics. Let's see how many more pages. This is a long chapter. OMG, you guys. Okay. Enough though, they were fraternal twins. You hardly knew they were brothers. Early on, they had to deal with the reaction of strangers who made a fuss over how they looked, how you couldn't tell them apart. But their mother's taste in boys' shirts had a lot to do with that. Signal flags and checks bought by the pair. And Paul, the second born, knew was a distant difference between them from one day. He was always a lot bigger than I was, and I guess you'd have to say he was more mischievous to begin with, too. Neighbors with children were also quick to single out Peter as a problem child when he was still a toddler. Tom Hines, before he became assistant district attorney, lived several houses down from the Burkes, and remembers that whatever Peter Burke was around his kids, someone usually ended up crying. Invariably, the instigator was Peter. If I knew he was around, I kept an eye on what was going on. Always felt uneasy about him. He would barge in, grab something from one of the kids, then pushed them to the ground. He was that kind of kid. In school, as early as second grade, he was recommended for special education class adjustment problems, and lack of achievement were given as reasons. He stands out to the memory of his third grade teacher because he did not have a normal facial expression. It was very, very cold. No emotion showed on his face whatsoever. And very, very calculating. You never knew what he was thinking. She was used to kids that age expressing themselves with joyous spontaneity, and remembers Peter Burke sitting at his desk watching her with a doubt expression, solitary black rock rising out of the sea of jubilant faces. Even at home he was troubled. His older brother and sister's rooms were off limits, but if he felt like it, he would go in anyway. Rummage through their stuff, and as if he found something to his liking, claim it as his by right of want. And that wasn't the only time he behaved as if everything around him was there for the taking. If he felt like going for a bike ride, he would walk around the neighborhood and he spotted two-wheeler not in use. Simply take it without asking. This willful and heedless attitude found its most extreme form when he started stealing money from his mother's purse. With 60, 80, and $100 in his pocket, he would head downtown, buy himself lunch, mosey over to the department store and purchase a bunch of new toys, treating any of the neighborhood kids he wanted to come along. Naturally, his mother, who lived from check to check, was put out with him when he pulled a stunt like this. But curiously, Doreen was lenient when it came to disciplining Pete, and reacted defensively whenever he was criticized to her face. Mothers in the neighborhood, when they came to her with a complaint or tried to talk to her about her son, found she refused to listen. Trying to make sense of the bond she seemed to feel with Peter, one neighbor attributed to the fact that when he was just 2 months old, he contracted whooping cough and almost died. And because Doreen came so close to losing him, she was overprotective of him even after. Whatever the reason, Doreen was closer to Pete than any of her other kids, and it was the impression of those who were aware of this that he took advantage of it and could have gotten away with unaliving. The relationship between the twins was not harmonious by any means. Blood ties in no way meant kindred spirits, and the difference in their personalities let them be referred to as light twin and dark twin. Paul was outgoing, well-liked, easy to get along with. In the summer, he was always on the go, playing outside, participating in pickup football and basketball game with the neighborhood kids. Pete, on the other hand, was an extreme introvert who gave you the feeling he didn't like people and didn't trust them, an attitude it hardly need be said that did not win him many friends. He didn't seem to have the least interest in sports, and if he wasn't hanging out at home with his mom, he would often just stand on the street corner smoking cigarettes and watching cars go by. To passerby, it seemed he was giving them the evil eye, reviewing various options and about to do the devil's work. According to Paul, they both knew right from wrong, but Pete was always going to do that what he goddamn pleased, although the reasons for many of his actions were totally obscure to his twin brother, like when he took a hammer and went out to the yard and bare holes in the fence, or when he got pruning shears from the garage and were around the house pruning the shrubs down to nothing. What was all too clear was his total lack of conscience. Sorry was not a word in Pete's vocabulary. He would never apologize for his misdeeds or give the impression he had any misgivings about anything he did. He could walk away from a wrong as if it wasn't his brother, because it was his past. without thinking about the consequences or seeming to care much if they caught up on him. Pete was always doing what he shouldn't. All I heard about was Pete did this, Pete did that. He was always out of line, it seemed. His brother remembers, and because Paul managed to avoid trouble, people would say to Pete, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" Paul was constantly held up as an example of goodness that contrasted his badness. This was true to such an extent that it fostered a resentment in Pete. Rather than try to compete with his brother half on terms not on his own choosing, he would punish him, take it out on his smaller brother in a variety of ways, ranging from petty to nasty. It might be a pinch, a shove, or a punch, and it might be the destruction of something personal. Paul loved airplanes, and he would painlessly glue and painted model planes, only to have Pete bust them up in reaction to a reprimand that included a reference to St. Paul. Their respective performances in school were another difference. Throughout elementary school, Paul received good grades and praise from teachers on his report cards, while Pete was obviously unproductive and constant behavior problems. By the time he was in junior high, his student discipline report read this way: disrespectful to Mrs. Alvis, attended open house bugging teachers, skipped sixth grade, period, didn't come home, suspended from school, cigarettes in his pocket, his brand was cool, goofing off in studying hall, lightning fireworks, and finally, 10 swats. Corporal punishment with a wood paddle was still in use in the Farmington schools, and Peter Burke had absorbed the record number of swats ever administered to a student in a single session. But the punishment left him unfazed, and school authorities miffed. Recalls a vice president. There was only so much you could do with someone like him. The code he lived by was such that the reasonable deterrence didn't seem to make any difference to him. At one point, both boys were tested by a guidance teacher, and even though Pete was hard to test, he was quiet, surly, difficult to work with. According to the examiner, both were found to be possessed of an equal share of smarts. They were found to have IQs in the range where, if properly motivated, they could be considered college material. Taking it to a challenge to find out what was holding Peter back, what was wrong with him, that he did not feel what other kids that age seemed to feel, the counselor arranged for a conference with Doreen Burke, who showed up for the meeting late, intoxicated, and uninterested. By this time, most of the teachers were aware he came from a household where domestic tranquility was unknown, but there existed a disagreement between faculty and administration on how to handle him. His English teacher, Barbara Alvis, remembers feeling caught in the middle. I got Peter Burke, who was in the ninth grade, and he stands out in my mind as a constant problem. He was disobedient and disrespectful, disruptive. He was hostile, imprudent, and unmanageable. He wouldn't do his work. He would sit in the back of the room, and periodically I would check the student's desk, and there was a lot of writing on his. Four-letter words, shocking language, scrawled into illumination. I wasn't particularly afraid of him, but I kept a close eye on him and never felt I could turn my back on him. I didn't trust him. He was one of those kids you have to keep your finger on all the time. At times I was worried about losing control of the class with him in there. On several occasions I went down to the principal's office and spoke to Mr. Crawley about him, but Mr. Crawley was very, very sympathetic towards Peter Burke because of the home situation. I assume he had dealings with the mother before, because he said there was no point in trying to talk with her. She would not respond, and he himself did not seem to want to be much as far as a punishment because of that, which put me in a difficult position. It was clear to me that he was a boy who had been let go. There was no control at home, and people like Mr. Crawley didn't want to do anything because they felt that, somebody had to express some love and compassion for a child like that. I didn't feel that way. I felt that he was getting away with far too much, and if somebody didn't draw the line, well, I had a friend who taught next to me, and we both commented how he was a type who was going to end up in the someday. New Mexico boys school someday. He didn't like school, sports were a bore. He didn't have any close friends. The only thing he did express was interest in cars. He was always checking out cars. He was just 10 years old. He was leaving the house and going downtown to the auto dealerships to admire the new cars in the showroom windows. An avid reader of car and driver and motor trend, often was more conversant about the new models than the salesman. The only thing I ever heard him say he wanted to do with his life, Paul remembers, was test cars for the Motor magazine. By this time it was just the twins and their mother at home, but Doreen's need for companionship meant there was a steady stream of men coming around the house. When she decided to let one move in with her, it introduced a whole new dynamic of discord, particularly with Pete. Used to being around his mom's favorite, he was particularly resentful of this expansion of the household by someone who dominated his mother's attention, chronically unreceptive to instruction or authority. He refused to recognize the substitute father's right to tell him anything. Neighbors report looking out their windows at night and seeing Pete sitting by himself on the curb in front of his house while his mother partied inside. It did not surprise them in the least when they heard he had ran away. Pete wasn't my best friend or anything. He lived in the neighborhood and I felt really sorry for him, which was the main reason I hung around with him. I knew his mother was an alcoholic and the guy she was living with was a big drinker himself, 'cause I walked by the house on my way to school and I'd stop and pick him up, and they'd be in there with drinks in their hands. Either started early or were still going. I know Pete for 2 or 3 years and never saw her sober once. One day we were walking to school and Pete said he wanted to get away from his family. I had no problem with my family. I was just adventurous. I'd always wanted to go someplace where I hadn't been before. So I was ready to go wherever the wind blows. He wanted to go to Dallas, where his sister lived. So instead of going to school, we were off and running for Dallas. We had less than $2 between us. We just snuck out on our thumbs and caught a ride to Albuquerque. Kept going from there. We didn't do much eating or sleeping. Where we did sleep finally was in Amarillo. We were hanging out in the lobby of a Ramada Inn, and this bellhop let us stay in a room that a couple had checked out of early. So we stayed there about 4 hours, took a shower, then left. An hour later, we were picked up by the highway patrol for hitchhiking, and they called our parents in the trip. Pete was a pretty moody guy who didn't seem to give a shit about anything. Always seemed like he was angry at life. There was absolutely no parental control at home. He could come and go when he wanted, stay out at all hours. Nobody cared because they were drunk. Or if his mother did say something, he paid no attention for the same reason. Some of the things he did, I don't think he thought about what would happen because he never had to answer to anybody. I don't remember him being especially aggressive or he was kind of mean to animals. He didn't like cats or dogs. He'd boot a cat if it walked out to him. As far as people, I don't know what he liked a whole lot of people either. I mean, he was pretty much afraid of people, I think. He wouldn't stand up and fight anybody. Even if he was in the right, he wouldn't stand up for himself. So a lot of people used to pick on him. If he did hurt someone, I don't think it would have made a lot of difference to him because I think he thought when he was hurt, nobody gave a shit about him. Not long after he was returned, Pete asked his older brother if he could move in with him and his wife. He said he couldn't take being around home anymore. He was told he would be welcome as long as he lived by the rules in their household. He always had trouble with authority. Nothing turned him cold like being told what to do. But anything was preferable to living another day at home, he said, and moved in with Raleigh and Mitzi. Several months later, his mother died, although Pete showed at least it was opinion of siblings that he probably felt in most. Now the oldest brother became the legal guardian of the twins, and after selling the house, feeling the need of a change of scene and responding to an offer of employment elsewhere, Raleigh moved to Forks, Washington. Less than a year later, the company he was employed with went out of business, so they returned to Farmington. This was March in 1974. Throughout this time, Raleigh's wife had grown increasingly concerned about Pete, citing his rebelliousness, his inability to communicate, and his cruelty toward his twin brother. She arranged for him to see a family-oriented therapist. Surprisingly, he didn't object, but when she thought about it, she decided his willingness to go into therapy had less to do with an admission he had a problem than with the fact that it would get him out of school. Enrolled in Farmington High School as a sophomore, he remained an introverted person of limited friendship with one exception. He took up with another student that no one seemed to like either, a kid by the name of Vernon Crawford. Dr. Rada did not read the results of the psychological report on Orrin Thacker until he had concluded his own interviews with the youth, but his conclusions closely paralleled that those Dr. Quink. He found Thacker lucid in his description of events on Saturday night in question, willing to admit he was not within sin, but in a long way from confessing to murder. He said that, along with the two other youths he implicated, had assaulted an Indian male and that it was something he'd done on a number of different occasions. But he insisted that he in no way expected the situation to end in death, and swore that when they left the Indian was definitely alive because as he walked away he heard him groaning. Though he admitted that he had smoked a joint of marijuana on the drive out, Thacker denied it had any serious effect or that use constituted a history of drug use. The youth was polite almost to the point of being obsequious with Dr. Rada, and struck him as a basically passive youth with a poor concept. There was reason to wonder about the character of this passivity. Someone with a better image of himself would have asked himself, "What am I doing here?" Or he might have blown the whistle on the others, or at the least extracted himself from the situation. But when he followed a standard course of questioning, branching out on the basis of what was said, nothing Rada heard made him feel the boy was so disabled and mentally ill and had a mental illness. He did not know the nature of his acts or that they had come out of a sick mind. Thacker seemed to him to be little worse than your classic follower. Likewise, Dr. Quint encountered a boy who was courteous and cooperative, whose performance on the Ressler Adult Intelligence Scale indicated he has a superior grasp of social mores and values, as well as superior abstracting and organizational abilities, but was someone who has not yet developed his internal resources that would provide the necessary attention to details, motivation to achieve aspirations. Coupled with this in his need for approval and recognition from others, so that the presence of persons with status, he would behave in a courteous and somewhat decent manner. In itself, this trait was not necessarily a deficiency unless it suggested something deeper, which it did to Dr. Quink. Signs were also evident that Mr. Thacker was difficulty in delaying gratification of his needs. His judgment in some instances would be impaired, resulting in behavior which would be impractical and at times delirious to himself. Taking it one step further, it was very likely he would do things on a date in order to obtain recognition and approval by peers. Boyd Thacker knew the oil field business inside out, a ruddy, rugged fellow who talked like a backwoods hillbilly. He was partners in a firm that truckled water out to drill rigs for making mud, a standard procedure used to wash out the fragmentation generated by the bit. He was at home in the oil patch, but of late was spending less time in the field than he was functioning as a customer man. He'd hear on the news that Amoco was going to drill 50 new wells. So he'd find out whom to talk to, call up, and say, hey, why don't we play a little golf tomorrow afternoon? Yeah, okay. So they meet at the San Juan County Club and play a round or two, and he'd pick up the tab. And when they went to the clubhouse afterward, maybe they'd play a few hands at customer gin. When he let the old boy win $100, then he'd buy dinner, drinks, and when the time came for Amoco to start operations, when they needed water delivered, Boyd got the call. His wife Joyce was a different story. She was a tiny woman with a bouffant hairdo, sharp features, and refined taste, who kept an immaculate house decorated in the French provincial style. She doted on her puffy, wire-haired terrier, was active in the Lutheran Church and assorted women's organization, and every other week hosted a two-table bridge group. There was absolutely nothing about Joyce Thacker that would place her with a hard-working, hard-drinking roughneck and two big-booted boys who were spitting image of their father. Boyd Jr. was the oldest of 20 months, and he was always be 2 steps ahead of his older brother Orrin. More mature, more popular, better looking, the superior athlete, Orrin it almost seemed dropping out of the Sybil rivalry race at the starting line, as though he knew he could never measure up no matter how hard he tried. So why bother? But then it could have been his temperament too, because he was always happy-go-lucky, supremely easygoing type who never took life seriously, who by his own admission was content to go find a shade tree and watch it go by. In school, though, he was never perceived as a real discipline problem. He was quickly identified as a poor student, a boy with low ability, no motivation. When asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he would answer, a lumberjack, and giggle. He was a D and F student who thought it was funny when he flunked a class. Those who believe a person's penmanship reflects a mind of work and find it significant that when he entered the 8th grade, his English teacher was appalled to discover he could barely write. I don't remember if he was left-handed, but there was such an odd, cramped slant to his tiny letters, and it seemed that way. And there would be so many misspelled words it was hard to read what he wrote and make sense of it. Other teachers would recall him as a boy who seemed to constantly be auditioning for the role of class clown. He had to make a flip and funny comment about everything. He would deliberately misunderstand the questions in order to get a laugh. If someone got in trouble, he would snicker. His junior high science teacher remembers, by the things he would say, you would think he was 10 years old. One time we were talking about the clouds around the planet Venus and how if they were out of the way, we might be able to see the surface. Orrin piped up, "Why don't we take a big fan up there and blow them away?" Most of the time his bad puns and witless remarks left his classmates groaning when the effect was comically intended. For this reason he is not talked about in high regard. Having fun of Orrin's thing, remembers a classmate, whatever was fun, whether it was picking up on someone else's practical joke or doing something stupid, like throwing spitballs across the classroom, he was one of those types, and he had a little bit of reputation for being gross. I can remember him in junior high locker room spitting a loogie on the ceiling and watching it drop to see who fell on. Moving in a world of lowered expectations, where he appeared to take certain pride in getting by with the least amount of effort, Orrin dressed the part. He would come to school with his hair greasy and disheveled, and as though he hadn't bothered to brush it after waking up that morning. His shirt tail would be hanging out in back, the buttons on his front misaligned, his shoelaces would be untied and his fly open. They may have been the days when anti-fashion statement among teenagers were in vogue, but Orrin Thacker's ensemble did not strike his classmate as having been cultivated with any thought. As in the case of the nerd, who wore loud plaid pants and two different kinds of shoes, it was more like, well, we have to have clothes on or they'll throw you out of school. This was a contrast to his older brother's preppy neatness. It was almost inevitable that a kid like this would be given a nickname inspired in that devastating way kids have of zeroing in on a playmate's particular trait, and by their attention by turning into a flaw that someone seems to shape character. The cause of life. In Orrin's case, his peers had dubbed him the missing link because every day, everything about him seemed to suggest that he had not quite completed the evolutionary cycle. Physically, the nickname was at his thick lips, big ears, deep-set eyes under a heavy brow gave him a distinctly Samian coincidence, to which was added an odd birthmark, a bald spot the size of a $half on the top of his head. It fit with respect to behavior too. According to the nickname's author, he knew just enough to stay out of trouble, just enough to get by in the world, but not quite enough to be considered a full member of the human race. Once perceived in the light, everything Orrin did and said seemed to fall in line with what you'd expect of someone who had not quite finished the transition from ape to man, or so it appeared to those he ran around with. I remember sitting in his room. He had a telephone in there, and he would call strangers on the phone and record the conversation with the little attachment you stuck on the receiver. But before he dialed, he'd stuff his mouth full of crackers. So when someone answered, he would hardly be understood. He'd pretend like he was trying his best to talk and would be convincing, and also he would be convincing the guy on the other end, and would be so convincing the guy on the other end would get concerned. "Son, are you okay?" he'd ask. "You want me to call a doctor?" Stuff like that. And afterwards, Oren would play it back and laugh like hell. The missing link. Once we were out hunting in the Box Canyon north of town, and Oren was running all over creation, so I lost track of him. Anyway, I'm walking along, and all of a sudden a rabbit jumps up and runs off. So I aimed, and just as I pull the trigger, Oren's grinning face pops up in the sides between me and Rabbit. When he heard the bullet zing, it must have missed his head by inches, if that. He went straight up in the air and landed flat, the missing link. Over time, he would think that to have every slip and blunder turned into anecdotal evidence for those who got their kicks needling, you would wear thin. But it was no big deal to Oren, who never stuck up for himself. He not only endured kidding about his shortcomings, he would laugh along, even though he had the butt of a joke, as though it was happening to someone else. One day, Boyd and Oren were in my house. It was a Sunday afternoon, late afternoon, and we were watching a football game. Oren had fallen asleep in the chair in the den, and my dad happened to come along. When he saw Oren like that, he snuck up and came back with a can of shaving cream that he squirted on Oren's hand. Then he tickled Oren's nose with a feather until he slapped at it. Thinking it was a fly, out of dead sleep, Oren jumped up, and he stood there for a moment, wiping shaving cream out of his eyes, looking like he didn't know whether to get mad or cry. Before he got this goofy grin on his face, he'd say, "Golly, you guys, you really got me. Way to go." So basically a good-natured kid, there was a side to him that concerned his more astute observers, and that was his susceptibility. I can't pronounce this. Susceptibility to forceful personalities, which in adolescent usually turn out to be troublemakers. Oren was impressed by them, drawn to them. He wasn't above getting into a little bit of trouble himself to win their approval. Unfortunately, he was often unable to recognize when they were laughing at him instead of with him, and it became a minor amusement for some of the tougher ones to purposely egg Oren on, encouraging him to show off and make mischief, just to see him get in trouble. Being the kind of kid who was capable of thinking to himself, "Okay, you're my friend, you're daring me, so I'll do it," who would try just about anything if he thought it would be cool or neat or new. The missing link obligated them. Trouble, it sometimes seemed, followed Orrin Thacker even when he was looking for it. Dusty Downs, a classmate in junior high school, is the right person to talk about this quality. Whenever I think of Orrin Thacker, I think of I had him in English class in the 8th grade, and this one day the teacher stepped out of the room momentarily, and as soon as she was gone, these two kids got in a fight. They were rolling around on the floor and whatnot, and got close to Orrin's desk. Now Orrin, he used to wear these wingtip shoes that might have been his dad's because they didn't fit him, were real loose. He never tied his shoelaces. And when these guys rolled into Orrin's desk, somehow one of his shoe came off his feet and got under them. So he tried to get it back, but ended up getting tangled in with them. And when in the middle of things, when the teacher walked back in the room, all three were sent down the hall and got swapped. And Orrin had nothing to do with the fight whatsoever. He was just trying to get his shoe back. Looking back at it, looking at the reason, all of what followed came down on Orrin. That scene would prophecies for Dusty Downs the way Orrin Thacker's luck ran. It always seemed he was dealt the bad hand. By the time Orrin was in high school, relatives with his parents had become so strained that those who came to the house Orrin had to sneak around to do anything. They didn't see his mother that much, but they would hear her screaming at Orrin when they stood outside. Orrin Thacker turned that stereo down. Orrin Thacker, what are you doing now? Orrin Thacker, look at the mess you've made. At times, Miss Thacker's obsession with cleanliness made it seem that her kids were boarders in the house. Things always had to be just so. Friends who entered Orrin and Boyd's room, noting the beds were made with military neatness, all clothes were hung up, and the general lack of clutter, would sometimes remark, "Gee, guys, what's wrong here?" Mr. Thacker wasn't home a lot, and when he was, he often had a whiskey or beer in his hand, both of which seemed to make him cranky. You never know from one day to the next what kind of temper he would be in. Some days he acted like he remembered exactly what it was like to be young, and if one of his sons wanted to borrow the truck, he'd say, "Sure, go ahead, enjoy yourself." Other days he would be grouchy, unpredictable, and capable of crushing plans with a no. That would be explained with a "because I said so" in the conversation. Boyd Jr. and his father seemed to get along slightly better than Orrin and his dad, which could be attributed to Boyd's success in athletics. He was a starting in on the Farmington Scorpion football team, while the Donkey's tail was always being pinned on Orrin. Keller Haney, a high school chemistry teacher who lived next door to the Thackers, had his doubts about the boy ever since he began to find empty billfolds under a pinyon tree in the backyard, where his lot cornered with theirs. Although he couldn't prove Orrin was the culprit, he didn't think it was Doc Coates, who lived behind him, or Jack Morgan, his neighbor on the other side, who was a state representative at the time. And when Haney turned the wallets over to R.T. Tolliver, a principal of the junior high school Orrin attended, who lived across the street, he checked the IDs, and it turned out the wallets were being stolen out of the phys ed class Orrin was in. When lightened life for Orrin was the way his older brother included him in his own circle of friends. If Boyd went downstairs for a Coke, Orrin came along. If he went rabbit hunting in Chokecherry Canyon, Orrin was welcome. If Boyd and his friends got into a pickup game of basketball in the driveway, Orrin would be there. They got along well, which was unusual for brothers so close in age. Nonetheless, even though Orrin was included, he was generally perceived as a tag-along and known to be somewhat over-hardy in his efforts to establish his right to be there. Not that he would initiate anything. The only time he went first was on a dare, but you could always count on him to join any activity enthusiastically. Significantly, he was asked to list his 4 best friends on a questionnaire distributed to students his junior year in high school. All the names were seniors, and all had been friends first. In his own class, because of his propensity for getting into trouble and his slothly appearance, Orrin was not considered exactly acceptable. The few friends he did have his own age tended to be the independent types who, like him, live by day to day, moment to moment, from one good time to the next philosophy. Kids who on weekends in shared parasimmons of mindless youthful energy were into taking risks. For a while, bashing trash cans was their sport. Armed with machetes and basketball bats, they could cruise down an alley, jump out and whack out the trash cans. Often Orrin developed a reputation as a cleanup hitter because when he started swinging, sometimes he could get carried away. On his way back to the car after doing a trash can, he was likely to take out the headlight on a parked car. It wasn't that he was such a violent person or got off on vandalism more than he was excitable. According to his friends, they began rolling Indians as a lark. You go down to Copper Penny, haul a couple of dollars out, and them Indians would come up and they'd stick their head into the window, 'cause we'd talk real low and we'd grab their hat, spin out and throw dirt all over them. It was just a kid prank. 3 incidents, it seems, turned into something more. The first was the Kevin Arnold accident. Several days after it happened, Orrin and his friend walked over to the yard where the wrecked Corvette had been towed. That really hit us. You could tell they'd been to the Pizza Hut before it happened because there was pizzas and blood all over the inside car. It was bad. Tommy Kitchens was also along on the second. This one night, me and Orrin decided we were going to go roll Indians, and just by chance, as we were going down the alley, we came across an Indian stretched out on the pavement that somebody else had already wasted. He was hurt pretty bad, bleeding from the side of his head, where it looked like he'd been hit with a brick. So we went and called the police. They told us, "You see that again, don't bother calling." The whole business of drunk Indians getting away with unaliving, and the impression that the cops had given up on the problem, appeared to disgust Orrin, and it provided him and his companions with a rationalization for their nocturnal adventures. When they felt the need to justify hurting people, they talked about it in a way of sending a message to the Indians to clean up their act. The third and perhaps most significant development was that around this time he took up with Vernon Crawford. They were never best friends. There was a lot of guys closer to Orrin than Vernon. Orrin first got to know him when they had a morning class together. Since they were always in the same spot and the same time, they would often go to 7-Eleven for something to eat before class started, or they would eat lunch in Vernon's car, the only place on campus besides the designated areas where they could smoke cigarettes and not get in trouble. Nor was in a friendship in which they drew one another out or talked about things, explaining the camaraderie he felt. Orrin once said, "I always thought he was sort of a lonely guy, off the wall and kind of weird. Maybe that's why I liked him, because nobody else would be his friend. I'm sort of that way." When they started rolling Indians together, they did not do any serious beating at first. They just harassed Indians. Usually there were other kids along, but at Vernon's, kicks became unfortunately rougher than ranks thin until it was just Peter Burke and himself. Originally, the hearing was scheduled for Friday, May 14, but Dr. Winslow and his team had not completed their evaluations by that time, so they were given an additional 2 weeks. The new date designated by court was Friday, June 7th, the day before the annual Sheriff Posse Parade. And that is the end of Chapter 7.